repeat what you're saying, the initial invite, as people come in after you do? I can do that.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, because the interpretation channel
kicks in.
Yeah,
Right.
The interpretation won't be on, so sure. Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so I think that we are live, if Andrew from Revere can confirm. All right. Great. So I'm going to open up the waiting room and we will go from there. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the first public forum for Next Stop Revere Inclusionary Zoning. We will be getting started shortly. We just want to leave a little bit of time for some more folks to join us. So sit tight. We should be getting started at about 5 after. Thanks so much.
Muy buenas noches, gracias por unirse a nosotros esta tarde. Estamos por comenzar en un par de segundos, solo esperando que entre más gente. Esta es nuestra primera sesión, nuestro primer foro público sobre zonificación inclusiva de la ciudad de Revere. Tenemos una agenda bastante interesante y ya comenzamos. Gracias.
All right, thank you everybody for joining us. I see we're getting some more new folks in our meeting today. This is the first public forum for Next Stop Revere Inclusionary Zoning. We're grateful that you're taking the time to join us today. We will be getting started at about 5 after. We just want to leave a little bit of time for some more folks to join us. So in the meantime, hang tight and we look forward to talking with you today. Thanks so much.
Muy buenas tardes nuevamente, muchas gracias por estar acá. Estamos viendo que más gente está llegando, solo estamos esperando un poquito más. Vamos a comenzar a las 6:05 en nuestra primera foro público sobre zonificación inclusiva. Solo tengo un poquito de paciencia, comenzamos en un minuto. Gracias.
Sorry, I was just logging in our group of students in another classroom.
Thanks, Fatu.
All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Karina Oliver Milchman. I'm Chief of Housing and Neighborhood Development at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, which is the regional planning agency for Greater Boston. We're working with the City of Revere to develop an inclusionary zoning policy, which is why we're all here tonight. Thank you for joining us and for spending your next hour and a half with us. I want to go through very briefly some Zoom tips for this evening, and then we'll start things off with a welcome from Mayor Rigo. So first, I want to note that there is Spanish interpretation tonight, thanks to Claudio Ruiz, and I'm going to pause there so that we can turn on the Spanish channel and give people a moment to settle in.
Thank you, Karina. I'm going to proceed now to give instructions in Spanish. Muy buenas noches, gracias por estar acá. Estamos a punto de comenzar la interpretación, la función de interpretación al español en Zoom. Va a ver en un segundo, la imagen del globito en la parte de abajo de la pantalla de Zoom. Hace clic ahí y escoge español. Si está en una tableta o en un teléfono celular, usted va a ir a los 3 puntitos, escoger lenguajes, escoger español y asegurarse de hacerle clic donde dice Done o Done para que funcione. Gracias. Thank you.
Great. I've started the interpretation channel, Claudio.
All right, thank you, Christian. And I'll just introduce Christian Brandt as well. He's with MAPC. He'll be overseeing our event tonight. A couple of other notes. You probably noticed that you cannot unmute yourself, but you can have your video on if you like, and we encourage people to have their video on so it feels a little bit more like an in-person meeting. Because you can have video on and not everyone is going to be speaking tonight, if you'd like to have whoever's speaking at that moment appear larger on your screen, please choose the speaker view rather than the gallery view, which is in the upper right hand of your corner. We also have the chat function on tonight, and please feel free to use it. We think the primary function should be to ask questions rather than to make statements. And if you're contributing a lot, I'd encourage you to take a step back and take a look at what other people are sharing in the chat. We will answer as many questions as time allows. And we also expect that the presentation tonight will provide a lot of information that hopefully you're looking for. And at the end of the evening, if there's time, we will have a public comment period where you'll be able to raise your hand and share your thoughts. And the last thing I want to note is that we'll be doing some polling tonight. One poll will help us get a sense of who's in the space with us, who's participating tonight. And a couple of other polls will help us understand what your priorities are for inclusionary zoning in Revere. So the polls should pop up automatically. As you take them, make sure you scroll down to the bottom so that you answer all of the questions. You'll hit submit when you're done and then close the window. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mayor Rigo for our welcome.
Karina, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I do just want to let everyone know that I'm about to start recording as well. So I'm going to start recording. If you don't want to be in the recording, feel free to turn your video off, although we, of course, would love to see your wonderful faces as we dig into the content today.
Thank you, Christian.
Recording in progress.
All right, Mayor Rigo, please take it away.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Karina, and thank you all for being here tonight. You know, we announced the start of our inclusionary zoning process last month, and so today we're joined together with a collective interest in bringing more affordable housing to Revere. So whether you're here as a resident, an advocate, a developer, or an active community member, your presence here tonight is central in leading this effort for our city. In Revere, and I don't think I have to tell everyone this, but our neighborhoods and our diverse neighborhoods are the foundation of our city. And you all know just as well as I do that we're growing faster than ever. And it is really important that our housing production and that our housing policies keep up the pace to support all of our residents. So I'm excited, as I know many of you are on this call, and especially the folks from MAPC who I have to give a special shout out to. Thank you for all the work that you've done. We're excited to start this inclusionary zoning process and work to maintain and increase housing opportunities for everybody in our community. And so for those of you who don't know, really short description of inclusionary zoning. Inclusionary zoning is a really powerful municipal planning tool that ensures newly constructed residential development of a certain scale includes a percentage of units that are deed restricted to be affordable to lower and moderate income residents. And so adopting inclusionary zoning is an important feature of a growing city. And we've seen many of our counterparts take that step, and it was a key recommendation in the Next Stop Revere master plan, which I know many of you are very familiar with, and you were part of that process. And that process was based on really extensive public input that was gathered in 2019. That was an effort that the city had not taken in over 40 years. And so getting that feedback from residents is really important. And this is probably one of the biggest policy decisions and policy recommendations that came out of Next Stop Revere. And so as we continue to grow, this policy will allow for the city to maintain and increase housing opportunities for all residents. And I'll end by saying that we've appointed an incredible team of folks for our Inclusionary Zoning Advisory Committee. And I know that they will offer some great ideas, some great solutions, and collaborate together on a final recommendation that will ultimately go through my office to the City Council for approval. And I'm not going to take much time, and I want to hear from the folks that are on this call, but I want you to know before I close out that I'm here. My office is always here to answer any questions and to hear any feedback that you all may have in this process. Please, I would end by saying, please tell your neighbors, tell your friends, tell everyone that you know in the community about this. We want to get as many folks involved as possible because this really is a community effort. So thank you. And thank you to the team at MAPC and the team at the City Revere, led by Tech Lang, all of the great work that you all have done. Thank you for putting this together, and thank you for putting this forum on. Thanks.
Thank you, Mayor. All right, so I want to set the stage for how the night is going to proceed, and I apologize for the formatting issues on this slide. It makes the evening look far more mysterious than we intend it to. But hopefully this is the worst glitch we encountered tonight. So we had our welcome from Mayor Arrigo. We have about 10 minutes for me to give an overview of the inclusionary zoning project. We have about 10 minutes to do our poll to understand who's joining us tonight at this meeting. Probably won't quite take 10 minutes. And then we have about 50 minutes for Alexis Smith, Principal Planner at MAPC, to provide an overview of what inclusionary zoning is, building on the definition that Mayor Arrigo shared. And her presentation will include additional polls to help us understand your priorities for a local inclusionary zoning ordinance. And then we have about 5 minutes at the end for public comment and next steps. And the only other thing I want to say up front is that we also have a survey opening tonight, which will be up until I think November 23rd. And that survey reproduces a lot of the information you'll hear tonight for people who can't join us tonight, and also reproduces the polling questions we're asking for tonight as another way for us to collect input from the community. Okay, so moving a couple slides down now to slide 6, Christian, thank you. So Mayor Revere mentioned Next Stop Revere, your planning process in 2019 that ended in 2020. Like all master plans, it had a housing element that did a very in-depth analysis of housing conditions in Revere. And I wanted to highlight just a couple of findings that help us understand why the city is moving forward with inclusionary zoning at this time. So one of the first findings worth highlighting is the high cost of housing in Revere. At the time of the analysis, the median market rent for a one-bedroom unit in the city was $2,000. And for context, a single-person household earning the median income in Revere, which was about $36,000, could afford an apartment priced at about $900 a month, so less than half than the median rent. And that metric of what they can afford is set to help households avoid becoming housing cost burdened, which means they pay more than 30% of their income on rent or mortgage payments, et cetera, which is considered too much, too high. At that point, people tend to start having to make serious trade-offs around other expenses. And the other thing worth noting is that among neighboring communities like Everett, Lynn, Malden, Chelsea, the median rent in Revere was higher and the median income was lower. Similar conditions for the home ownership market in Revere. Sale prices increased steadily since 2013. So between then and 2017, the median sale price of a single family home rose from about $260,000 to about $360,000. So $100,000 increase. And in the same time period, the cost of a condominium increased from about $220,000 to over $305,000. So given the discrepancy between the high cost of housing and the median income in Revere, it's not surprising that 44% of households are considered cost burdened, meaning they do pay more than 30% of their income on housing in the city. In addition, there are about 12,200 low-income households in Revere out of about 20,400 households total. And low income means that they earn less than 80% of the area median income, which we're going to talk about in detail shortly. And close to half of those 12,000 low-income households, more than 5,000 of them, are considered extremely low income, meaning they earn less than 30% of the area median income. So for those income eligible households, the city has about 1,780 deed restricted affordable housing units. Essentially, those units can house approximately 15% of the low income households in the city. And the rest of those households need to find housing on the open market. And sometimes they have vouchers to help with those costs. Sometimes they don't, and they become cost burden. So that's just to set the stage. And moving on, the master plan has a number of recommendations to address some of the housing challenges in the city. And one of the primary recommendations was inclusionary zoning, which is why the city decided to move forward with implementation of this policy by working with MAPC to develop inclusionary zoning that's rooted in the specific housing context of Revere, including its market and the needs of its residents, as well as best practices. So the scope and timeline for the project, skipping ahead one slide, will take us through the spring. We'll do additional analysis of housing needs. We'll do market research. We'll do research into inclusionary zoning best practices. We'll do an analysis of Revere's zoning ordinance so that we can better understand how inclusionary zoning will fit into the existing zoning in the city. And then a huge portion of the work is financial modeling with a tool called a development pro forma, which is what developers use to test their project proposals. And this will help us test different inclusionary zoning scenarios to see how they affect development feasibility. And then, of course, we'll ultimately draft zoning and we'll provide technical assistance through local adoption. Inclusionary zoning does need to be adopted by your city council with a 2/3 majority vote. As Mayor Arrigo mentioned, this process is guided by an inclusionary zoning advisory committee. If we move on to the next slide, the ISAC, as we're calling them, is a group of local leaders with knowledge of and commitment to meeting housing need in Revere. We have several of the ISAC members on this call today, and I thank them for joining us. Their primary role is going to be to strategize and advocate for this process to ensure that this process reflects the needs of Revere, that we hear from the people who stand to benefit from inclusionary zoning, and then also to help raise awareness about what inclusionary zoning is, about how important it is for the city, and about why the city council should move forward and adopt the policy that we build consensus around through this process. And then I want to touch on community engagement in the next slide. As you all know far better than MAPC, Revere is an extremely diverse community with over a third of the population non-white, many residents who primarily speak languages other than English. The city has a very high proportion of renters, more than half of whom are cost burdened or pay too much for housing. And this means that many portions of Revere's population are challenged by the high cost housing market and face displacement pressure. And it's crucial, therefore, that those who engage in the inclusionary zoning planning process reflect the diversity of the city and reflect those who stand to benefit from an inclusionary zoning policy. So we'll do our best to hear from people of color, renters, low-income residents, non-native English speakers, and many others throughout this process. Next slide. And the way we're going to do that is by hosting a series of focus groups, which are smaller, more intimate settings to talk with people about how their housing needs and about their housing challenges and their priorities for inclusionary zoning. We will also have citywide public events like this one tonight, and a second one where we'll collect input on inclusionary zoning recommendations. And then sort of parallel to that engagement, we'll be doing engagement with local real estate professionals to make sure that we have reasonable assumptions about how development works in Revere, and that our financial model is set up to reflect the reality of development on the ground in Revere. So I'm going to pause there, and we're going to do a poll to get a sense of who's joined us tonight. We have over 50 participants here, and I'm going to turn it over to Christian to get that poll live for you. Just before I do, I'm going to ask Christian to advance to the next slide where we have the polling questions in Spanish, because the poll itself will pop up in English.
Great. So in just a second, you should see a poll pop up in front of you. If you're on your phone, it will actually cover the screen. But if you're on your computer, you'll be able to move it around. So if you need to view the Spanish language questions, you can move the poll out of the way so that you can see those. All right. So these questions will just help us understand who is joining us today, and they'll be important for us to understand the next community engagement efforts that Karina was describing.
So as I mentioned earlier, please do scroll down because there's more than one question in the poll. There's actually quite a few in this first poll. Most of the other polls have fewer than this, but we wanted to make sure we had a good sense of who we managed to connect with tonight, so that we know how to change our outreach approach if necessary next time to make sure that we're connecting with enough people and the right people. So we'll pause here for a couple minutes to give you a chance to answer these questions.
All right. We have about 50% of folks have responded, which is great. So we'll just
to enter anything in there. It's like when I'm touching it, it's not going.
Yeah, Fatu, that is because you are a co-host.
Ah.
So you won't be able to respond. Yes.
Yeah.
All right, so I will leave it up for just a little bit, maybe 20 more seconds. So if you're still working through the poll, there's your prompt. All right, so in 5 seconds, I'm going to end the poll. So if you're still working on it, make sure you get to the end and submit. Great, we've got about 62% of folks have responded, so I'm going to end the poll, although we did just get a response, so I might wait a little bit more. It seems like some folks are still working through it.
Okay, well, it looks like we have fair representation in the space tonight. We have a good mix of homeowners and renters, which is nice to see. We have a fair number of younger participants here tonight, which we don't always get. So I'm really glad to see that, as well as the older residents for taking the time to participate tonight. And we have a range of incomes as well. So thanks everyone for sharing that personal information. It's really useful for us as we continue with community engagement throughout this process.
All right, so I have ended the poll. And just as a reminder to those of you who are co-hosts, if you are a co-host, you aren't able to respond to the poll. But if you want to be able to take the polls, just send me a DM and I'll be happy to make you a co-host, or make you not a co-host. All right, Karina, over to you.
All right. So actually, I think we can advance the slide, and I'm going to pass it off to Alexis Smith, who again is a principal planner at MAPC. I was going to say an inclusionary zoning planner because she does do a lot of inclusionary zoning work. But Alexis will run us through what inclusionary zoning is, how it works, and take us through a poll to understand your priorities and goals for the policy. Alexis.
All right. Thanks, Karina. And thanks so much to all of you for being here tonight. It's great to be with you virtually and hopefully start to hear some of your priorities for what this policy, for how this policy takes shape. So before I get into what inclusionary zoning is and how it works, I want to spend a little bit of time to talk about what affordable actually means. And you can advance the slides, please. Affordable means so many different things to so many different people. So I want to talk about what I mean when I use the word affordable and how we're going to be talking about it in terms of an inclusionary policy for Revere. So the straight definition of affordable is that it is housing is affordable if a household spends 30% of their income to live in that particular home. Next slide, please. So generally, when housing is affordable, as Karina mentioned already, a family would have enough income left over to cover medical care, food, transportation, all of these other things that households need. But once a family starts to spend more than 30% of its income on housing, it becomes a lot more difficult to pay for these other expenses as well. And so now an important thing to remember is that because affordability varies based on income, a home that is affordable for one particular family might not be affordable for another family that earns less money. So, what's affordable to a family that has two adults who are both working full time, that same house might not be affordable to a senior who's retired and is living on Social Security. So we're going to be diving into, different levels of affordability a lot later on tonight. Next slide. There's a couple of different kinds of affordability in housing as well. Affordable housing can be either naturally occurring, what we term it, which is housing that happens to be available on the private market, like you would find on Craigslist or Zillow or whatever website you do your housing searches on, and it happens to be available at a price that's affordable to many families. This type of housing is often less expensive because it's older, because it's smaller, or because it's in an area where there's a little less demand. This type of housing is very important because, as Karina mentioned earlier, there's not enough subsidized housing to go around. So it's important that every city have this type of housing, but because it's not subsidized and there are no legal restrictions on its price, it can become unaffordable over time. So the next slide, the type of affordable housing that Karina was speaking about earlier is deed restricted affordable housing. And that is legally required to be affordable for a certain defined amount of time. This type of housing is almost always created with either public funding or through local policy. The deed restriction will require that the home be affordable to families earning a certain income as well. So that gets back to the what is affordable question. It will define that it needs to be affordable to a certain income. This is the type of housing that an inclusionary policy would create. So I want you to keep that in the back of your minds as we're talking about creating affordable units through inclusionary zoning. We are talking about specific legal, affordable housing with a legal restriction for a certain income. So as I'm starting to reference to all these different types of, levels of affordability, I want to get into something called area median income. Next slide. The federal government uses something called AMI, or area median income, to define who is eligible for deed restricted affordable housing. AMI varies depending on family size. So a family that, a 4 or 5 person family would have a larger AMI than a 1 person, household, say. But in general, the thing you have to remember about area median income, or AMI, is that it's kind of the dead center of what an area earns. Half of households earn less than this amount, and half of the families in an area earn more than this amount. Next slide. In current year, the AMI for all of Greater Boston, which includes Revere, is almost $121,000. So it's quite high. But the important an important caveat for that is that even though this area includes Revere, it also includes Boston, all of the outlying suburbs, and Revere's median income, next slide, is much lower than the region's overall. It's about half. So that means that when we talk about that many homes that are officially affordable, according to the definition that I gave earlier, within all of Greater Boston, they might not be affordable for many Revere families. So that's one of the things that we're going to get into is, really trying to parse out how to straddle this, the greater need that exists in Revere. Next slide. Affordable housing programs typically set income limits based on who the programs are intended to serve. And these are common income limits are families earning 30% AMI, 50% AMI, 60% AMI, or 80% of AMI. Now, I just rattled off a lot of numbers, and I'm probably going to continue to rattle off these numbers over the course of the evening and in the next few months. And they can sound very technical and personal, but they represent real people who are struggling to make ends meet and to find housing that they can afford in town. So I'm going to take a few minutes to go to give some examples of what this actually means when we talk about 30% AMI versus 80% AMI. So 30% AMI is the kind of the lowest income tier. Next slide. It includes a range of incomes. Again, what the actual AMI is depends on how big your family is. But in general, a family earning 30% of the area median income or less will be among the city's lowest income families. For folks who have just a single person, that's approximate to 1 adult working full time earning minimum wage. You can see as a grocery store cashier or in food service. For a 2-person household, that could be 2 retired adults who are both bringing in Social Security, or someone working in housekeeping. And then as you go up the line with family size, it could be 1 adult working as a preschool teacher or an ambulance technician. So starting to get skilled, but still quite not a small salary to support 4 people on. This is kind of the deepest level of need that the government classifies. So the next tier up is often typically either 50% AMI or 60% AMI. Those two are kind of the common middle level of the low income spectrum. There's just as a caveat, 60% AMI is shown here, but they're relatively similar. Keep in mind, we talked a little bit before about Revere's median income. That's $55,000. So that very roughly aligns with 50% of the regional median income. And again, just kind of getting into putting some faces on what this means. It could be a single person working in a trade, such as a dental assistant or a tailor. For a 2-person household, it could be, again, one person working in a trade, or 2 adults working at more minimum wage jobs. Or as the family sizes get larger, it could be an adult in the school, teaching in the school system, or 2 adults working full time at a variety of professions. The final income category I'm going to talk about is 80% AMI. Now, a family is considered as if low income if it earns up to 80% AMI. So all of those previous income levels that I talked about and this one are considered low income. Now, these incomes probably seem pretty high, especially compared to the Revere's median. But the reason why these are considered low income by the federal government is that families in this income bracket are still likely to struggle to afford housing that meets their needs on the open market. That housing is so expensive that even families that earn money at this level probably may not be able to find a house that they can afford, or will have a difficult time doing it. So a single person household, this would be again an adult working in the trades, all the way up to, for a 4-person household, it could be a lab technician working and partnered with a mechanic. Different types of different combinations can get you to 80% AMI. But again, I just want to emphasize, even though these seem high, there's a need for housing at this level as well. So we just talked about spent a lot of time talking about different income levels. There's also different types of programs that the government sponsors that target different income levels. At the lower income the lower end of the income spectrum. So at that 30% AMI, greatest need, those programs are all fairly deeply affordable. That consists of, if you have a housing voucher or Section 8, if a person is residing in public housing. There's a lot of federal funds for nonprofits to build more affordable housing units, and that serves these lower income levels. These programs are wonderful because they are able to serve folks who really, really need affordable housing. But the downside is that they're very, very expensive because folks in these categories have so much need. It costs a lot of money to provide them with what they need. On the other end of the spectrum, there's market-based programs. And, these could be inclusionary zoning, like we're talking about, linkage fees, a lot of policy programs that kind of hitch their coattails on private development or the private market and leverage that to provide some level of affordability or affordable programs. Now, the positive side of this is that it costs very little money for the public, for the city to administer, if at all. The downside is that because the city doesn't need to put a lot of money into it, it's not really able, these programs aren't really able to serve the lowest income families. These programs are not and will never be a replacement for deeply affordable housing offered by the housing authority or by nonprofits. But one thing that cities can do to achieve deeper affordability through these programs is by supplementing these market programs with public resources. So there doesn't need to be next slide. There doesn't need to be a solid defining line between the two. There cities that want to very intentionally reach, get a little bit deeper affordability can use resources to achieve that goal. So I'm going to take a step back from affordability and now talk about inclusionary zoning, what we're all here tonight to discuss. So first of all, I'm going to talk about what inclusionary zoning is and how it works. It is a local policy that is enacted at the local level by the city government. You can advance the slide. The policy at its heart requires that a certain number of homes in new housing developments be deed restricted. There's that term again, the legally required to be affordable to a specific income level. Next slide. So you can see if in any given market rate development, it would say, all right, you have to provide a certain number of units to be affordable to low income families. Next slide. Again, getting back to that different types of programs serving different income levels, inclusionary zoning is a market-based strategy that relies on private developers to build affordable housing, often without subsidy. It is one tool of many tools that the city has in its toolkit. Again, I'll say this, I'll probably say this several times over the course of the evening. It is not meant to replace deeply affordable housing offered by the housing authority or nonprofit housing. And this one policy is never going to be able to solve all of the affordable housing need in town. But it is still a great tool to advance meeting housing need. The last point I want to make on this is that because it's market-based, because we're asking the private market, just a landlord or developer to provide this public benefit of affordable housing, the policy components need to be very carefully balanced to make sure that we're maximizing affordability without making a project infeasible. And I'm going to get a lot more into that in a little bit. The way that the city ultimately decides to balance these different components depends within their ordinance, depends on Revere's priorities, depends on what we hear from you and your priorities. There's a lot of different ways that you can meet goals through an inclusionary policy. So, looking into what when I talk about balancing components, these are the components I'm talking about. Any inclusionary policy will include both requirements, so affordable units, this first icon here, the number of affordable units means, you can advance the slide, how many units are required to be affordable. Typically in this area or nationally, you'll see 12%, 15% of homes in a development is a very common requirement. That's just, again, the basic, how many affordable homes are you going to build as part of the development? Next, the other major piece of that is what income level the policy will serve. By far and away the most common income levels are 60% to 80% area median income. So at the higher end of that low income spectrum. 80% is kind of the default. If 80% AMI is the default, if a city or town isn't going to give a lot of thought to it, but towns or cities that are being thoughtful can achieve deeper income levels. The other critical piece is incentives. So we've been talking a lot about, we can't ask for too much or else that might make a project infeasible. Well, incentives are how the city is able to ask for more or deeper affordability. The incentives balanced with these requirements are how you really achieve a policy that starts to meet the city's goals. So that's common ones are allowing more units than would otherwise have been allowed, again, to incent or to subsidize the affordable units, reduce parking near a T station, fee reduction. Some less common ones are tax relief or property tax relief, but that's certainly something that the city can consider to really reach those deep levels of affordability. Another aspect of things that we'll be considering is whether or not the developer could be allowed to make a payment, or what's called an in lieu payment, to the city instead of building affordable homes as part of the project. Those funds would then be used by the city to build to fund affordable housing programs. Other things to consider are whether the affordable homes are required to be built in the subject development or could be built elsewhere. geography. Sometimes cities or towns will have different requirements for different areas of town, depending on if there's a particularly strong market somewhere. The city will consider project size, which is, how big a development needs to be before the policy comes into place. And then some cities will look at design and how that comes into play. The biggest ones are this top row, and those are what we're going to be asking you about tonight. So one last thing before we start really having a robust priorities discussion, it's important to spend some time talking about how these policy components interact and how housing development works generally. The goal, I'm about to get very into the weeds here, but before I do that, I just want to give a big picture framing that the goal of any inclusionary program is to produce affordable housing. So I don't want that goal to get lost as we start to talk about the weeds. The goal of the policy is to create more affordable housing, and that's a good thing. So now I'm going to get into the weeds here. Regardless of whether a home is deed restricted affordable housing, so legally required to be affordable, or market rate selling for, however many, whatever price, building housing today is very, very expensive. Even to build an affordable unit, it's going to cost anywhere from $350,000 to $400,000 per home to build housing, and that's just how much it costs in Greater Boston these days. And so we're starting from a place where housing is very expensive to build. And next slide. Most of these costs, from the land to the construction materials to how much you pay the architect, are outside of a developer's control. You can see the developer fee actually makes up a pretty small percentage of what it costs to build housing. And even this, developers don't get paid until a project is built. So starting out, they're taking on a lot of risk, which is one of the reasons why we're focusing on what's feasible. Next slide. So after the housing is built and folks are living in it and it's up and running, there are additional costs to keep the project running beyond buying the bricks and the concrete. There's financing costs, which essentially means, in order to pay for the concrete and the contractor and the wood, the developer took out a loan from a bank and sought investors, and they must pay that loan back as part of the ongoing monthly costs. Next slide. The other costs that a project needs to be able to handle are operating costs. A lot of these are similar to what any one of us would pay as part of our family operating costs, only on a much larger scale. A building, the project needs to be able to pay for utilities. It needs to pay for maintenance and upkeep. If there's a leaky faucet or a leaky roof, it needs to pay property taxes. All of this, are things that a developer takes into account when they decide if a project is feasible. So those are all the things that those are all the things that all the project costs. A project also brings in income. To pay for those costs, the developer needs to charge rent. The vast majority of project income is from rents, but sometimes if there's a charge for parking or for pet fees or whatever else, there might be additional income. And I want to stress, this income is not all profit. This is what is used to pay to keep the lights on, to pay to plow the snow, all of that great stuff that needs to happen. So a project is feasible when the developer thinks that the project income, that orange house, will be sufficiently greater than project costs. And then whatever income is left over after costs are paid, that's the return to the developer and the investors. So I'm going to say this many, many times, the income has to be greater than the costs, or else the project won't be built. And we want to avoid that, because if the project isn't built, then that doesn't produce any housing, market rate or affordable. So we definitely want to avoid that. So this is what happens in a market rate project. If we look at adding, a market rate project in a city without inclusionary zoning, would be expected to bring in a certain amount of income through project rents. If the project is then required to add some affordable units through an inclusionary policy, those units still pay rent. They're still paying, generating income, but it's less than than market rate rents, and so the overall project income is less. That's these affordable rents are kind of represented by the yellow here. They're still bringing in income, they're still generating income for the project, but the overall income is less. Now, most projects have some cushion to absorb some affordability. If the rents are, if there's only a small amount of affordability, a project can generally absorb that. But next slide, the more affordability that's added, the more the project income shrinks. And so you're adding more and more affordability, that income amount becomes smaller and smaller. And the smaller the income gets, the less feasible the project is. Next slide. Because even as the project income shrinks and the project is accommodating more and more affordable units, the costs don't change. It still costs the same amount of money to buy concrete or to plow snow or to have a plumber come fix the leak, regardless of whether a home is market rate or deed restricted affordable housing. And so once the income from rents drops below a certain amount, the project isn't feasible. So that's why when we talk about what we can ask from an inclusionary policy, we can't ask for 50% of the units to be affordable because there just won't be enough income. Nonprofit developers or the city could build housing with a lot more affordability. But when a nonprofit developer builds a housing with a majority of the homes affordable, that takes millions and millions of dollars in subsidy that usually take a couple of years to put together. And that's how nonprofit developers are able to do it. Without those millions of dollars in subsidy, once you get to a certain point, the project just doesn't work. So next slide. When we're talking about how to, where we want to focus this policy, what Revere wants, is most important to Revere and to you in terms of what a policy can provide. One of the most important balances is between the number of affordable homes and the income levels served. Again, because when you add more affordability, either more units or deeper or lower income residents, that brings in less money in rent. Typically, the two have an inverse relationship. Some cities say we want to maximize the number of affordable units, as many affordable homes as possible, even if it means that they're not serving even if they're serving kind of moderate income, the teachers and the firefighters and the electricians, that's where we want to focus. Other cities might say, our need is to serve the lower income residents. And so we prefer to target deeper in lower income levels, even if it means fewer affordable homes. So we're going to start asking you what your priorities are about this. I know that that's kind of an impossible choice to choose more units or units that serve or homes that serve lower income families. There's no wrong answer, and the city and MAPC are going to absolutely study both options and come up with several different policies that will address both options, but it's very helpful to us to understand what is the most important to you. So with that, we can bring up the poll. And again, this is, I believe there's 2 questions here, so be sure to scroll down. And it's a difficult choice to choose between the two, but it's very helpful to understand what is most important to you.
Thanks, Alexis. Just really quickly before I launch the poll, I don't think we made this as clear last time, but Zoom only lets us have one language in the poll, mostly because of limits on the amount of words that you can have in the poll. So that's why we've included the Spanish language translation of the questions on the screen. If you're joining us on your phone, like an iPhone or other smartphone, once I launch the poll, you won't be able to see the questions that are on the screen. You'll only be able to see the poll questions that are in the poll. But if you're on your computer, you will be able to move the poll question out of the way so that you can see the poll, the translated poll questions. It would be, but I also will just note, all of these questions are also included on the survey that Karina has shared in the chat. So if for whatever reason you aren't able to respond to the poll during today's meeting, you can go answer the identical same questions on the survey that Karina has shared in the chat. So without further ado, I'm going to launch this poll. So you should see something pop up in front of you just right now.
And so the first poll question deals with the, more affordable units versus fewer units that serve lower income household or families. The second question deals with your priority for family housing. There are ways to design a policy that will emphasize units for larger units, 3 or more bedrooms for families. So we're asking you how you would prioritize family size housing as well.
All right, so we've got a good amount of responses coming in. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to take the poll. It is certainly a difficult choice, like Alexis mentioned, but I will leave the poll up for a little bit longer so that more folks can respond. Looks like we have 65% of people who've responded.
And again, we will be studying both ways to provide as, a greater number of units and ways to serve lower income families. This just helps us understand what's most important to you. And we will be, bringing some of the, or, considering those when we make our recommendations, which we'll be bringing back to you at a future forum.
All right, so we have 78% of people who have responded. We'll leave the poll up for 10 more seconds while we wait for some additional folks. If you haven't submitted your question yet, make sure you submit it soon. All right, I'm going to end the poll. And Alexis, would you like me to share the results?
Yes, please.
Great.
So, all right, so it looks like, I think you all can see the results, but it looks like people are fairly, evenly, a slight preference for more affordable homes over homes that serve lower income folks. Again, we'll be studying both of those. And then a pretty strong preference for family size units that will, larger units with more bedrooms that will serve families. So again, thanks you all. This is incredibly helpful as we study and determine what we're going to be looking into. Moving on, this is where it starts to get more fun. Even though I have been emphasizing, there's only so much that an inclusionary policy can do, and it can't solve everything. There are things that a city can do to support a policy that serves lower income families or provides more units. So that's what I'm going to get into right now. The first thing on a very high level is to increase project income. And again, when I say that, I'm not referring to increasing return to developers. I mean, increase the amount of income that a project can use to then pay its costs. So this is, this is the cost offsets that we're talking about. The theory is, if a city wants to ask for a lot of affordability, like in that first house there, then it can do things to increase project income that will then bring those costs or bring that income to be back up to be greater than costs. So there are a couple different tools that we can use to encourage this. A very common one is allowing more units than would otherwise be allowed, sometimes called a density bonus, but it could be in terms of letting the building be an extra story taller than might be allowed, looking at different setbacks. There's a lot of things that the city can do to allow more units to be built. And again, that's not more units for the sake of more units. That's more units so that the additional market rate units can then generate extra project income, which subsidizes the affordable units. Other things that can happen to increase project income, some cities choose to buy down the inclusionary homes by subsidizing deeper affordability. And again, that's just using city funding. The other thing that cities can do in their policies to reduce costs. So we just talked about ways to make that orange house bigger. Now we'll talk about ways to make this blue house smaller. There are some things that could be allowed upfront when the project's being built to reduce costs. This could include saying, less parking is required near transit stations. Parking is very expensive, and those costs get passed on to the residents. So allowing less parking is a good way to reduce costs. The city could require or reduce permitting fees that a project has to pay when it gets its building permit. This one is less common, but is actually can make quite a difference in terms of the affordability that the city can ask for, is providing property tax relief. So saying, we won't tax the affordable portion of the project, or to say we'll only tax you at a certain share of the project. That can go a long ways towards enabling the city to ask for deeper affordability. And again, in this case, when we're talking about reducing costs, even if the income is small is lower from more affordable units, then the costs are lower too. So it all balances out. So now we're going to ask about policy priorities in terms of what you all think would support for trade-offs in exchange for more affordability. So the first thing we'll ask about is, let's see, in order to get more units, or to get a higher or a lower income target, what incentives you'd be willing to, will it be asking you about incentives that enable that, that will allow the city to ask for more affordability. So if you could bring up the slide, please.
Awesome. So like last time, again, the poll will show up on your screen in just a second. And just as a reminder, again, these questions are available on the survey, and the survey is translated into Spanish as well. Mm-hmm. So in just a second, I'll launch that poll. Mm-hmm.
And it looks like it's coming up here. I just want to emphasize that there's no right or wrong answer, and that some of these may be difficult. We're really just getting a sense for what's important to you. And there are also many different paths that we can use. We're asking you about different cost offsets specifically, like one at a time, but cities will typically mix and match. There's all sorts of different ways that the city can really pull in different pieces of these elements to make a policy that's very tailored to meet their goals.
All right. And you do have to scroll down. So I'm seeing some of our answers starting to come in, which is great.
You might also need to expand the poll window so you can see the full question. If any of you are having that text cut off, you can hit the square box in the upper right corner of your poll to expand it, and then you'll see more of the question itself.
All right. All right, thanks everybody. Really interesting feedback. Thanks so much. All right, so we have about 79% of folks have participated. So in 10 seconds, I'm going to end the poll. So if you're still working on it, submit your answers now. All right, so I've ended the poll and I'm sharing the results.
Great, so just looking at these off the cuff, it looks like folks are fairly split, slight preference for allowing more homes than would otherwise have been allowed in exchange for affordability. Pretty favorable, pretty strong support for allowing less parking in areas near the T station. Strong support for lower for moderately lower property taxes in exchange for more affordable homes, and still a decent majority of folks supporting substantially lower property taxes. So that's certainly something that we'll be studying as we continue to look at what this policy could provide and how it can be tailored to meet the city's needs. So the final thing that we're going to ask you about is some more priorities. These are a little bit less cut and dry. There's less like financial trade-off here, but these still are important aspects of the policy, and we want to hear what you all think about this. As I've mentioned before, one of the pieces of a policy could be to allow a developer to pay a fee instead of building the affordable homes as part of their project. The plus side of that is that it generates income for housing programs. But the negative side is that it usually generates, it'll generate less than the cost of what it costs to actually build a home. So that's, I'd say there are a lot of communities in Massachusetts that allow it. There are a lot of communities with inclusionary policies that don't. That's the city's preference. But again, it's, that sorts of income would typically be less than what it would cost for the developer to build a home. The second thing we'll be asking about is different location alternatives that would still require the developer to build affordable homes, but perhaps on a different site or in a different part of town. That gives the developer greater flexibility to meet affordable requirements, which can be a positive, especially if the city is going to ask for a lot of affordability. But there is a question of geographic equity there, particularly if the market rate housing is near the T station, near an area that has a lot of amenities with, walkability and access to groceries. If the affordable housing is built in a different part of town that's perhaps less desirable, there's an equity question there. And then the final thing we'll be asking you about is whether a policy is citywide or whether there are different requirements for certain areas. Some cities will take this approach if the housing market is very different. If one part of town has a very strong housing market and other parts of town less so, to be able to really maximize what they're asking for. So we're going to continue on with the poll. And
yes, launching in just a second.
Yes, thank you.
So there are multiple questions in this one as well, so you will have to scroll down.
This one might take a little bit of time. I know that some of these options are a little or take a little while to read. We appreciate you giving them your attention.
All right. So we have about 57% of folks have responded, so give it a little bit more time. There are, Ralph, that's a good question. I just noticed there are supposed to be only 3 questions on this one. So the 4th one is actually in the next poll. We just couldn't fit all the questions on the screen at once. Oh, interesting. I'm seeing some folks saying the poll disappeared. I think maybe the poll was ended, although not by me, so I can relaunch it. We only had 57% of folks respond. What would your preference be, Alexis?
Yeah, let's relaunch it, and we can continue
Great.
Talking while folks are answering that. We want to make sure we give everyone a chance to respond. As folks have said, though, if things just aren't panning out for you, these are also the same questions that we'll be asking in the online open house. We'll be giving you a link to that. So this is not your only chance to offer input. And in particular, I guess if you did submit a response, I would say maybe refrain from responding.
No, they should answer again.
Oh, they should. Never mind. I apologize. I apologize.
Yeah, I think the poll, sometimes Zoom works in mysterious ways.
Yes.
The poll ended prematurely last time. We definitely want to make sure everyone responds. So even if you responded the first time, we had to start over. So take this poll again. But hopefully this time it'll be quicker because you've already answered it. So you know what your answers are going to be.
Yes, thank you. And for those of you who have finished answering, we would love it if you would start thinking of folks who you think might also who live in town, who might also like to answer this. These questions are going to be available as part of the online open house. And the more responses we get, the better we'll be able to tailor a policy. The better we'll understand what you're looking for from an inclusionary policy and come up with solutions that try to meet those goals. So please spread the word.
All right, so it looks like we have about 74% of folks have responded. So I'm going to leave the poll up, which it should still be open. I'll leave it up for about 15 more seconds. So if you haven't responded, now is your chance. All right. I'm closing the poll. And I'll share the results.
All right. So just walking through this, looks like a moderate preference for requiring that affordable homes be built in the same building as market rate homes rather than in a different location. Very strong support for building the affordable homes as part of the market rate development rather than making a payment to the city. And then again, very, very strong preference for homes on site as opposed to in lieu payments. So we can stop sharing that. And then I believe there is one more question.
Yes, so this is the last question for the last poll. So we thank you all for participating. And this time there are only 2 questions, so hopefully you won't have to scroll down. And I will be launching those in just a second. All right, so the poll should be in front of you now.
So in this first question, it's asking about, in both cases, require a developer to build the affordable homes. In the first option, allow them to build them in a different location, and the second option require them to that the affordable homes be built as part of the market rate project. And then the second question asks about different requirements for different areas of the city.
All right, looks like we're getting some good responses. Thank you everyone who submitted so far. We're up to about 75%, so I'm gonna leave the poll open for another 15 seconds. So if you are still trying to answer, now is your prompt to. All right, so I'm ending the poll and now I'm sharing the results.
All right. And just to debrief, it looks like a fair majority would support requiring that the affordable homes be built within the market rate development rather than in a different location, and a pretty even split in terms of different requirements for different areas of the city. Slight majority favor consistent requirements across the entire city. So thank you so much for this. It truly is valuable to us to have this information on what's important to you all. We hope that folks will continue, or that your friends and family will also answer these similar questions through the online open house. And with that, I believe we are going to open it up for public comment, which I believe we'll do using the raise hand function. You can, let me see, at the bottom of your screen, there should be a hand icon. If you press that, then we'll call on you to offer comment.
Right, so it's under the reaction button on the bottom menu. If you hit reactions, you'll see a bunch of emojis and then also raise hand. So click raise hand if you'd like to make a comment or statement, or ask a question that you haven't put in the chat and have already been answered. We'll give folks a few minutes to raise their hand. So any questions about inclusionary zoning or area median income or this planning process or the project in general, or comments or statements about those things?
We see Sylvia has her hand raised. And we did get one question in the chat about the advisory committee members. I will just mention that the names of the advisory committee members are actually on the first page or second page of the survey. So that's probably the easiest way to go. I don't remember everyone's name off the top of my head right now. But they're also on the project website, which Karina has shared in the chat, but that is www.revere.org/IZ. So Karina, I'm going to ask Sylvia to unmute.
Hello, Alexis. Thank you very much for very informational presentation. Housing is still very much a learning curve for me. So there's a lot to learn about this. But one question for you is, we tend to promote mixed use buildings, kind of thinking, first floor for retail or business, and then residential on top. Is that good? And does that contribute to increase or help with project income? Is that how you were saying it?
Yes. Thank you. And I appreciate, I think housing is a very, very complicated thing. So I appreciate that everyone's, looking to learn more about it. Typically, mixed income house or mixed, so what Sylvia was talking about was mixed use housing. So typically retail on the ground floor and housing above. That meets a lot of goals that many cities have, economic development goals, providing amenities near residential areas that are within walking distance, active street space. But it doesn't necessarily help the project income. It's not a good way to create more affordability. And the reason for that is that building retail can be pretty risky. It's a very different ball game than housing. Housing, there's infinite demand. A developer is pretty sure they're going to be able to find someone to live in whatever units they build. Whereas when they build retail, it's a lot harder to find a client. A tenant, that tenant might have different needs from how they built the space. It's a lot riskier, and particularly in terms of when banks are financing a project. Banks will look at that ground floor retail and say, I don't know about this. That means your housing has to be, very strong, or they'll just consider it entirely separately. So I don't want to knock ground floor retail. There are a lot of very good reasons to ask for it or to include it, but it doesn't necessarily help. It wouldn't be a way to help a city add affordability.
Great. Thanks, Alexis. So it looks like Ralph also has his hand raised. So I'm going to ask Ralph to unmute.
Thank you. Somebody already beat me to partial the punch in the chat, but my question is with inclusionary zoning, and I know on different types of programs, what they tend to do is with disability accessibility apartments, they tend to lump some of that in with their stipulations for meeting requirements. So inclusionary zoning, are some of those apartments going to be that accessible? Are those going to be counted as market rate? And if so, that is going to limit apartments that have disability accessibility to them. So is there going to be certain percentages to over and above disabled accessibility? Is there going to be a separate stipulation including inclusionary zoning?
That's a really good question. A lot of cities' regulations don't actually mention that at all. So I'm glad you brought it up. I think typically if 10% of units in a building are required by federal law to be accessible, then that same percentage would be required for affordable units, which may or may, as I can see your face, which might mean none. But that doesn't mean that the city couldn't expressly say that Revere couldn't say in their policy, we want to prioritize accessible, affordable units, because that there is certainly a need for that. And so
they'll double dip. What will happen is, I've seen it in different programs, they'll double dip. They'll say the accessible apartments are income, meet the median income, but then that limits the people that have with disability issues are in the same pool. So what some cities and towns are talking about now is going over and above for inclusionary zoning. If it's 15% and 10%, they tack it on as a separate. They don't count it. They make it a separate entity.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's there's no built-in requirement for that, but there's absolutely no reason why the city couldn't incorporate that into Revere's ordinance.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for your questions. So Alexis, Claudia Correa asked 2 questions in the chat, and I have to scroll up to find the first one. One was actually, I think, just a statement, but it just says inclusionary zoning should also require disability accessibility on design reviews. And then Claudia's second question is there a minimum number of units required per development when thinking about the 10 to 15%?
No, typically a policy would just say 10% of units or 15% of unit or whatever percent of units. The policy will also get into very, very nitty gritty details about, do you round up? Do you round down? How do you handle fractions? At what point does, are certain requirements triggered depending on project size? But, typically it would be expressed as a percentage, and there, the minimum number of units would be 1, I guess.
Awesome. Thank you, Alexis. So I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. I don't see any in the chat, and nobody has their hand raised. So if you have something that you'd like to ask, please feel free to either post it in the chat or raise your hand. We'd be more than happy to answer. Oh, I see Laura has raised their hand, so I'm going to ask Laura to unmute. Oh, you beat me to it, Laura. You're ready. You're unmuted.
Hi, everyone. I'm not sure I've thought through this question enough to do it coherently, but I'm really interested in understanding whether there are any examples of inclusionary zoning that makes certain things happen faster, either through incentives or requirements that can sort of change over time. I'm so concerned. I think it's important that we take our time and make this ordinance really, really robust and make it meet everybody's needs. So I don't want to shorten the process in any way, but I feel like we're so far behind the ball. Like, how can we put things into the policy that will incentivize doing more faster? So, you know, is it possible that we could, you know, start out with a 25% rate and some kind of offsetting incentive that kind of goes down over time as we get closer to the goal for what we know we have as an extreme deficit for affordable housing?
I think I'm kind of hearing two parts to your question. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you know, the first is just how can we get this to happen as quickly as possible? And I think, you know, we've been instructed to actually to move on this as quickly as we are able to. We've got a pretty fast turnaround time for a policy. In terms of the longer term question about how the policy might change as the city's priorities change. I always encourage cities and towns to revisit their policy on a pretty regular basis, and many cities have. You know, Cambridge and Boston have had their policies for quite some time, and they'll redo theirs like every couple of years. And that's either because the market is changing, so they find, you know, a lot of cities and towns will start off with a pretty light ask and then realize they can ask more, and they'll, you know, kind of ramp up their policy. We're hoping to, you know, already kind of get as much affordability out of this as we can. But, you know, I would encourage any city to revisit it as, you know, as the needs of residents change, as the market changes, and, you know, more or less can be accommodated. So this policy should never be a set in stone for the next 20 years thing.
All right, so I think we have to move on. So I'm going to turn it over to Karina to lead us through some closing remarks.
All right, thank you, Christian, and thank you everyone for your great comments and questions. Really thoughtful and a lot for us to consider as we move forward. I think there are one or two other questions left in the chat, so those on the call who are equipped to answer them, I encourage you to do so in the chat as we wrap things up. So first and foremost, if you advance the slide, here is the much hyped survey link, which has appeared repeatedly in the chat, but here it is on a slide. That survey is open from today through November 23rd. And we really want to ensure that we hear from a lot of different people who couldn't make it tonight. I think at our high point tonight, we had about 50 or so attendees, and we want to make sure we hear from more people in the community who have feelings and thoughts around inclusionary zoning, and particularly folks who need more affordable housing in their community. So please do, our ask to you is to share it to your networks, your families, your friends, your colleagues, as far and wide as you can over the next few weeks. In the meantime, MAPC is going to continue working with the Inclusionary Zoning Advisory Committee and the City of Revere on our technical analysis. And the next step for us is to reach out to real estate professionals like developers, realtors, and lenders to make sure we have a firm understanding of the local housing market conditions in Revere, any challenges pertaining to development right now, the utility of the potential cost offsets that Alexis described tonight to developers, benchmarks for lenders and investors, and other development assumptions. And all of that information, along with the priorities we've heard from the city and from the community tonight, is going to go into a financial model. If you go to the next slide. So this model, it is a financial pro forma tool that will allow us to test different potential inclusionary zoning scenarios to see how well the requirements we're making of developers can be offset by the different incentives we're providing to them to ensure that we're getting community benefits from developers without deterring development. So that's a big piece of our analysis going forward. And then next slide, this will be folded into zoning recommendations, as Alexis mentioned. Those recommendations will be developed in discussion with the Inclusionary Zoning Advisory Committee and the city based on the input we've heard tonight and based on the technical analysis I've just described. And we'll be returning to all of you and hopefully many of your friends and neighbors to share those recommendations and collect input on them a little bit later in the process later this winter. So with that, I thank you very much for spending the last hour and a half with us. It's 7:30, so I want to let you go. Enjoy your evening. You can find more information about this effort at revere.org/IZ, or I suppose that's /. So please do check out the website. That'll help you to get a sense of when the next community engagement activity is coming up and other ways for you to connect with this effort. Thank you all. Thank you to the Inclusionary Zoning Advisory Committee. Thank you to the mayor. Thank you to Tech Lang and Ruben Cantor on the call, and JD and other staff who I'm sure I'm forgetting. We appreciate all of your time this evening, and we'll be in touch with materials from tonight, including the PowerPoint, both in English and in Spanish. Thank you.